secrets that the rest of history overlooked. And what if those secrets could change the way you see faith, hope, and the very meaning of life itself? In the mountains of northern Ethiopia, far from bustling cities and the gaze of empires, lies a monastery older than most nations. It sits perched on jagged cliffs, wrapped in mist and mystery, guarding what many have called impossible to protect. A manuscript so ancient that its pages predate countless rulers, wars, and kingdoms. Scholars who have glimpsed it whisper of words so profound that they challenge the familiar stories of the resurrection. Words that reveal conversations and teachings of Jesus after he left the tomb, moments missing from the Western Gospels. The air here is heavy, carrying the scent of old stone, smoldering candles, and the faint aroma of parchment that has endured centuries. Shadows stretch across narrow corridors, and each step echoes with the weight of history. Inside, monks move silently, their white robes brushing the stone floor. They approach the scrolls with caution, as if a single wrong touch could awaken centuries of forgotten knowledge. And there, on a low wooden table, lies the manuscript. Its leather cover is cracked, its edges darkened with the hands of those who protected it through plague, invasion, and time itself. This is not a story of legends or myths. This is a record of events witnessed, heard, and preserved with care. It contains words Jesus spoke in the days after his resurrection, words lost to most of the world for almost 2,000 years. Imagine standing there, staring at the pages, tracing the flow of ancient ink, and realizing that you are witnessing knowledge almost no one else has ever seen. Yet, the urgency of this story is not only in its age. It is in its relevance. Today, countless people feel spiritually lost. They seek guidance, they wrestle with doubt, and they struggle to find certainty in a world full of noise and division. The questions humanity asks now are the same questions early believers asked then. Who is he truly? What does this mean for our lives? What happens after death? These words, preserved in Ethiopia, were meant for those exact questions, waiting silently for generations to arrive at the threshold of understanding. As you walk through this monastery in your mind, the candles flicker against stone walls, casting shadows that dance like echoes of the past. The monk unwraps the manuscript slowly, revealing pages written in Gizi, the sacred language of ancient Ethiopian Christianity. Each line is deliberate, each phrase a carefully chosen piece of a message that transcends time. These are not simple statements of fact. These are intimate conversations, lessons, and reassurances spoken by Jesus himself after conquering death. Words meant to comfort the fearful, strengthen the wavering, and guide the lost. The manuscript begins to unfold the story in ways few have imagined. It describes Jesus appearing not as a distant, unreachable figure, but as someone who speaks directly to hearts, acknowledging fear, doubt, and sorrow. It captures moments of tenderness, of recognition, and of courage that the Western texts barely touch. Here, every detail matters. The trembling of a disciple, the disbelief in Mary's eyes, the quiet awe of those who first saw him again. And as you imagine these scenes, you begin to sense the weight of what has been kept hidden, a fuller, richer story of resurrection that speaks to both the human and the divine. Standing there, as the dust rises from centuries-old parchment, a sense of wonder and anticipation builds. The silence feels alive, almost protective, as if history itself knows the importance of these words. It is a quiet revelation that defies the ordinary. You begin to feel that what you are about to hear is not just a story, but a doorway into understanding, into faith, and into a part of history that was nearly erased. And yet, This discovery is not for scholars alone. It is for you, sitting there right now. You who have come seeking truth, seeking connection, seeking understanding beyond what you have read in familiar texts. Your presence here matters. It validates the journey of those ancient scribes, the monks who risked everything to protect knowledge, and the countless believers who preserved every word with reverence. So, as this journey begins, know this: you are incredibly special to us. Your attention, your curiosity, your willingness to engage means more than any number of views. If you find this story meaningful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who are searching for hidden knowledge. Help us reach 10,000 subscribers so we can continue bringing these ancient truths into the light. We also invite you to comment below with your name, the city you are watching from, and the time you are watching. Every comment connects you to this story in a real way. And if you wish to support this research financially, the Super Thanks feature allows us to continue accessing manuscripts, translating texts, and bringing the forgotten wisdom of history to life. Finally, for anyone who wants to read the original sources themselves, the 88 Books Ethiopian Bible and the Book of Enoch in English are linked in the description. These texts hold the foundation for everything you are about to see and hear. Take a deep breath. Step closer. The story is waiting. The words of a risen Jesus, preserved for centuries, are about to reach you. And nothing you think you know about resurrection will feel quite the same again. The sun rises slowly over Ethiopia's highlands, casting golden light over jagged peaks and deep valleys. The landscape looks like it hasn't changed in a long time. Christianity found one of its first homes here, in a place where the earth rises toward the heavens, long before most of Europe even whispered its first prayers. By the 4th century, Ethiopia had fully embraced the faith, and with it came a duty that few could have imagined: to protect the Word of God when the world outside seemed determined to destroy it. It doesn't start with kings or armies. It starts with monks. They became the guardians of knowledge, quiet, strong, and devoted. Every day, they prayed, studied, and took care of things very carefully to make sure that the sacred manuscripts, the words that had been spoken by apostles and prophets, would survive centuries of chaos. Invaders marched through nearby lands, empires rose and fell, but these simple men kept working in their own little world. Every page copied and every line saved was a deliberate act of defiance against the loss of truth. Ethiopia's monasteries are living proof of this commitment. Aksum, the city with tall obelisks, was both a political capital and a spiritual stronghold. Its stone buildings, which have been carved with intricate designs, have been around for thousands of years. Inside these walls, monks would sit in almost complete darkness, their hands shaking slightly as they traced the old scripts, the ink slowly moving across the fragile parchment. Lalibela, carved from living rock, is breathtaking not only because of its daring architecture but also because of the centuries of devotion that are housed within its walls. As you go down stone steps to underground chapels, you can feel the cool air and hear the chants that have been going on for hundreds of years. Debra Demo can only be reached by climbing steep cliffs with ropes. It is the most peaceful place on earth. It was not by chance that it was so far away. It was a necessary barrier to keep intruders from destroying the texts inside. The monks themselves are very different from each other. Their lives are hard, strict, and lonely, but within that discipline grows a devotion that goes beyond pain or being alone. They get up before dawn, and their hands are rough from carrying heavy books and taking care of flickering lamps. They chant for hours at a time, and their voices mix with the stone to make a sound that seems almost alive. They fast, pray, and go through storms and hunger, all for words that the outside world may never hear. They are dedicated not for fame or recognition, but because they know how fragile truth is. They know that once a manuscript is lost, it can never be found again, along with the voices of the people who first walked with the risen Christ. Ethiopia's role as a safe haven for forgotten truths becomes clear in these monasteries. While empires in Europe and the Middle East fought over religion, deciding which books were holy and which ones could be thrown away, Ethiopia became a place that was not under the control of any empire. The rough mountains and deep valleys kept people safe, both physically and spiritually. Here, the manuscripts could stay whole and untouched by political ambitions or theological arguments that often changed the meaning of sacred texts. This was not an easy choice. It was forced by faith, history, and geography. Picture yourself walking through these monasteries. The smell of incense is strong in the air, and it sticks to stone walls and woven tapestries. Light comes in through small windows and falls on pages that have been around for hundreds of years. The ink is still sharp against the yellowed parchment. You can hear the soft voice of a monk reading aloud in Gizi, Ethiopia's ancient language. It sounds like he is talking to people who lived 2,000 years ago and to people who will come hundreds of years later. Each word is carefully chosen and each tone is carefully chosen because here, words are not just written down. They are kept, protected, and made eternal. It seems like the mountains are also doing this sacred duty. Aksum is a city that is connected to history, myth, and devotion. It rises from the highlands. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela sit quietly under the sky. Their huge shapes were carved out of living stone by people and with the help of God. The steep cliff of Debra is hard to get to, and it stands guard over the entrance to knowledge that few people can see. These places are more than just physical spaces. They are spiritual landscapes where every stone and hallway has been filled with faith and strength for hundreds of years. For the monks, preserving things is not a job. It is their calling. They live in almost complete isolation and sometimes don't see the sun for days, but their faith is still strong. They know that every manuscript they touch has been touched by many other people, and that each scribe made sure that no word, phrase, or idea was lost to time. They put up with pain, bad weather, hunger, and being alone, all for the sake of knowledge and truth that can't be measured in gold or silver, but only in loyalty and care. Ethiopia became the quiet protector of a message that might have been lost to history. This land held on to what was most important, even though other countries fell to the pressures of empire, conquest, and control. It is here that the words of Jesus, spoken right after he rose from the dead, were quietly written down, copied, and kept for future generations. These were not just notes or summaries. They were in-depth stories and conversations meant to guide, teach, and comfort generations who might have otherwise been spiritually lost. When you picture yourself standing in these old halls, you start to see how big the job is. Every monk, every copied word, and every careful stroke of the pen is a thread in a tapestry that has withstood both natural and political storms in human history. Without them, the voices of the risen Christ might have been completely quiet. Instead, the world got a rare treasure because of their hard work, an unbroken chain of knowledge that talks about hope, teaching, and the deep effect of a man who rose from the dead to speak to people again. These mountains, these monasteries, and this land are more than just history. They are a living proof of how strong faith can be and how far people will go to protect what they know is sacred. The words of Jesus came from these remote, sometimes hard-to-reach places, where they were protected from time, lost empires, and the passage of time. In Ethiopia, the last whispers of ancient Christian truth have survived. They are waiting for people who are willing to look for them, hear them, and understand how important they are. The trip started in silence, with only the sound of boots crunching on gravel and the distant call of birds echoing off jagged cliffs. Scholars, explorers, and monks from all over the world had come to see an artifact that no one else had ever seen. The path was dangerous, going through narrow mountain passes where fog clung to every ledge and old monasteries stood like stone sentinels against the sky. For a long time, people had heard rumors about a manuscript so old and holy that it contained the exact words Jesus spoke after he rose from the dead. These words were kept safe while the rest of the world didn't know about them. Torches flickered on the dark walls of a cave that was hidden behind the monastery. Shadows moved across rough stone surfaces, showing places where ancient relics had been left alone for hundreds of years. The smell of dust, incense, and time itself filled the air. Every step sounded louder than it should have, as if the walls knew the secret that was waiting for them. A bundle wrapped in goat skin and tied tightly with fraying leather cords rested on a low stone pedestal in the deepest chamber. The monks moved slowly and carefully, their hands steady but respectful, knowing that even a small mistake could ruin something that had lasted for 2,000 years. The monk whispered, almost in a trance, "These are the words he spoke after rising." The scholars leaned in closer. It sounded like the voice was floating in the air, mixing with the torchlight and the smell of old stone. There was a long pause before anyone spoke. The heaviness of what they were seeing and about to read filled the room like a physical force. Slowly, the bundle was unwrapped, and each layer of leather revealed centuries of careful preservation. There it was, a scroll written in Gizi, the holy language of Ethiopian Christianity, with dark ink on old parchment. The manuscript was more than just old. It was full of history. Every line had been carefully copied by hand and kept safe by monks for generations who knew how important each word was. It stayed alive thanks to hard work and smart thinking. It was wrapped in goat skin to keep it from getting wet and rotting, hidden in stone chests carved into the walls of monasteries, and moved from one safe place to another during times of famine or invasion. Every monk and scribe added to a long line of preservation that lasted for hundreds of years. This made sure that the message inside could survive both the weather and the fading of human memory. As the scholars' eyes got used to the dim light of the torches, they looked both shocked and amazed. Some people leaned forward, their hands hovering over the scroll as if they were afraid it would break. Others stepped back, feeling the weight of history in every letter. They had thought they would get bits and pieces, maybe summaries or notes, but this was much more than anyone had thought. There were whole passages that talked about what happened right after Jesus rose from the dead. They were written clearly and precisely, and they captured conversations that Western Gospels only hint at but never go into detail about. The responses were quick and strong. With a shaking finger, a historian traced the letters and whispered, I never thought we would see this." Another scholar put a hand on his chest, as if he could feel the past there. Shock turned into respect. The room was quiet for hours, except for the soft rustling of parchment and the sound of monks chanting in the hallways above. Every line of the manuscript seemed to bring the room to life, making a link across time that neither the scholar nor the monk could fully explain. The manuscript itself showed an incredible amount of detail. It told the story of Jesus appearing first to Mary Magdalene in the garden, but it was different from Western accounts because it included her thoughts and feelings, the shaking of her hands, the disbelief in her eyes, and the kind words Jesus used to calm her down. It talked about how he spoke to his disciples in rooms that were locked from the outside world, where his voice not only gave instructions but also comforted them, dealing with doubt and confusion in ways that the canonical Gospels don't. It even wrote down his warnings about future trials, his advice to spread the word with patience, and his belief that faith needed both courage and understanding. The scholars kept reading, which made the suspense grow. What did Jesus say that no one in the world had ever heard before? The manuscript suggested that there were lessons that were only meant for people who had seen his resurrection, and that these lessons were too sacred or too easy to misunderstand to be shared with a lot of people. There were words of encouragement, warning, and clarity meant to strengthen faith and shed light on parts of his purpose that had been lost or unclear over the years. Every line brought up new questions, and each one was exciting because it was like finding something that had been hidden for thousands of years. People were interested in the ways that things were kept safe. Monks passed the scrolls from one person to the next, and each generation made careful copies that were slightly different but still true to the original wording. Some scrolls were hidden under stone floors, some were put in secret rooms behind walls that could be pulled back, and some were sewn into the hems of robes during times of war or trouble. Because of this level of dedication, the text not only survived natural decay but also the unpredictability of human conflict. The manuscript's survival was a sign of both faith and intelligence, showing that dedication could overcome even the most difficult situations. The discovery changed how scholars and explorers thought about history and faith. It was both humbling and exciting to realize that these words had been ignored in the West but not in Ethiopia. Each phrase opened up new lines of questioning, showing that the resurrection was not just a moment of victory but a living, ongoing conversation that had been carefully preserved in a part of the world that few people had ever been to. They started to see why Ethiopia was the only place that could protect Christian truth. The landscape, the monasteries, the isolation, and the monks' unwavering devotion all came together to make a safe place for knowledge that might have been lost forever. But even as they read, everyone wondered how such a valuable thing could have stayed hidden for so long. Why did it take modern explorers and scholars so long to find something that had been so carefully kept? The answer seemed to be connected to the mountains themselves, their isolation, the discipline of the monastic communities, and the quiet insistence that some truths can only survive when the world doesn't control them. The manuscript was more than just paper and ink. It was a bridge between the past and the present, a reminder that light can still shine through the dark parts of history, waiting for those who are patient enough to find it. The morning was full of silence, the kind that makes your heart beat louder and presses against your chest. The tomb was dark, and its stone door was sealed by time and people. But already, a light was starting to gather around it, weak at first, like a breath on the edge of dawn. The ground seemed to sense the huge event about to happen, as if dust and dirt were moving slightly. The air felt heavy, like there was a tension between excitement and awe, as if nature had stopped to watch the impossible. Then, as if by an unseen hand, the stone that had blocked the entrance for hours or even days rolled away, showing the space beyond. The air inside looked like it was glowing with an otherworldly light. Light softly came from every corner of the tomb, filling the dark places where fear and sadness had been. The walls were rough from centuries of stone, and they reflected it like mirrors. There was a faint smell of incense or spices that were probably left behind by the people who made the tomb. There was no ghostly chill or creepy feeling. Instead, there was a warmth and a presence that demanded attention, respect, and awe. Then he showed up, not as the man they had known or as a spirit of mist, but in a form that was beautiful, bright, and glowing. His body seemed to be between the material and the divine, human but changed. Each step was purposeful, and each movement was on purpose, but there was an energy that made the stone chamber feel impossibly big. The disciples, who were outside the tomb with heavy hearts from grief and confusion, could hardly believe what they saw. As they tried to understand what they were seeing, the reality of life coming back from the dead, fear and hope mixed together. The first words of the risen Christ echoed through the quiet of the tomb, preserved for generations in the Ethiopian Gospel of Bartholomew. "Peace be unto you. Don't be scared." The statement was simple, but it was powerful enough to break despair and change hearts in an instant. There was no preaching, no rhetoric, and no attempt to scare people with power. Words that were soft but eternal, that brought light into the dark and courage into scared hearts. The phrase struck a chord with not only the first witnesses but also with every generation that would hear it. It was a balm for fear and doubt that would last forever. The disciples' fear slowly went away, as if it had been a heavy weight on their shoulders that was now lifted when they heard his voice. He said, "Peace, a peace that goes beyond understanding, a peace that comes into hearts that have been broken by grief and confusion." Then there was the courage, the quiet courage that comes not from power or strength, but from knowing that the impossible has already happened, that death has been faced and overcome, and that hope can rise even when it is buried. Each word was more than just speech. It was a bridge that connected the hopelessness of people with the certainty of God's presence and the grief-stricken with the promise of a new life. In the tomb, the light seemed to pulse with his presence, spreading out like a warm, comforting glow that was almost real. It lit up the cracks in the stone floor, the faint scratches on the walls, the signs of preparation and ritual that were still there, and it also touched the hearts of those who saw it, as if the light itself gave them comfort. Jesus' appearance was not only a victory over death, it was a revelation of what people have always wanted: clarity in the midst of confusion, hope in the midst of loss, and the deep reminder that even in the darkest parts of life, God is not absent but waiting, patient, and kind. His words went beyond those walls and through hundreds of years of history, speaking directly to the problems of every person. After chaos, peace. Fear gives way to courage. Light after darkness. People who are anxious, worried about the future, or feeling empty in their hearts can still hear those words today. They were first heard in the echoing chamber of a forgotten tomb. They are not abstract theological ideas. They are truths that people have lived and can now be experienced by anyone who is willing to accept them. Picture Mary Magdalene, her hands shaking and her eyes wide with disbelief, hearing him call her name and telling her not to be afraid. Think about Peter, who was full of doubt, and how the words changed him from being unsure to being sure. Every word is alive, a spark that gives people courage when they read it. It teaches that peace is not the absence of trouble, but the presence of a reality that is stronger than fear. The manuscript kept these moments not to decorate or study, but for the heart, to remind the living that even the darkest times can turn into light. The Ethiopian text gives more than just words, it gives context. It talks about the tremor under their feet, the disciples' hearts fluttering, and the silent awe that filled the room. It shows how strange resurrection is, how the ordinary meets the extraordinary, how the physical meets the divine, and how the familiar meets the incomprehensible. These details, carefully kept by monks over the years, let modern readers or viewers enter the scene, feel the air shake, hear the soft footsteps, and be amazed at a time when death itself was redefined. Every sound in Guizi is important. Every line lets you feel things that haven't changed in hundreds of years: fear, confusion, awe, and finally, a heart-opening hope. The manuscript doesn't just tell what happened, it makes the reader feel like they are there, bringing to life the sacred energy of a moment that changed the course of history. And as the words echo through time, one starts to understand why Ethiopia became the keeper of such knowledge. It wasn't just geography or being alone that kept these truths alive. It was the respect, discipline, and unshakable belief that some words must live on at all costs. These first words are striking to a modern viewer not because they are old or rare, but because they are still important. Fear, doubt, anxiety, and uncertainty are always with us. The words, "Peace be unto you," are a reminder of this. "Don't be afraid" is a direct challenge to them. They speak across thousands of years, showing us that even when the world is falling apart, our faith is weak, and our vision is unclear, there is a presence that is steady and unshakable, reminding us that the impossible can happen and that light can come from even the darkest places. And in this retelling, the tomb is more than just a stone room. It turns into a symbol, a stage for the never-ending conversation between people and God. Jesus' appearance is not just a historical event. It is an invitation for every heart that feels lost and every soul that is looking for comfort. The light that filled the tomb, the shaking earth, the stone that was rolled away, and his first words all come together to make a moment that connects the past with the present, the holy with the human, and fear with hope. Mary Magdalene walked through the garden, her steps uneven and dragging lightly over the wet ground, as if every step was heavy with grief. Her heart hurt in ways that couldn't be fixed, and every thought brought back memories of loss and absence. The morning fog clung to the edges of the flower beds and wrapped around her feet like a delicate veil, making the harshness of reality she couldn't yet escape seem less harsh. She moved like a robot, her eyes scanning the familiar paths. She tried to find comfort in the shapes and colors of the garden, but all she found was emptiness. Every stone, flower, and tree seemed to say the same sad thing. He was gone. She stopped by a group of olive trees. The sun was just starting to break through the fog with thin rays, making the dew look like tiny flickers of hope. Her eyes, which were red from crying, fell on a person kneeling near the ground and moving their hands slowly among the plants. For a moment, her heart raced with confusion as her grief mixed with a faint glimmer of recognition. She didn't see him for who he really was yet. She saw only a gardener, a normal person taking care of the earth, someone she could understand. And through that human lens, she felt a cautious stir of calm, an ordinary presence she could approach without fear. "Why are you crying, woman?" the figure asked softly, and the voice sounded familiar but also made her uneasy. Mary moved a little closer and squinted against the rising sun. The words were soft, not harsh, but they were full of compassion that cut through her sadness. Her voice shook as she said, "They have taken him away, and I don't know where they have laid him." Her hands shook as she spoke, and she wrung them together tightly as if to keep her composure from falling apart. The pain in her voice was real, and the air seemed to carry it, like the smell of wet earth and morning dew. Then, as she got closer, the figure called her name. It wasn't a distant, formal tone. It was a soft, deliberate voice that made her heart stop. "Mary." The one word spread across the garden like a soft breeze, clearing away the layers of sadness that had built up over the past few days. Her knees gave out, and the world seemed to tilt as if gravity itself knew how strong the moment was. She stumbled forward, shaking, not sure if she could trust the hope that was growing inside her. It was a very human response, disbelief mixed with awe, sadness mixed with excitement, and a weak mind trying to understand the miraculous. Mary dropped to her knees, covering her face with her hands. Tears flowed freely now, without fear or doubt. Her chest heaved as she cried. Each sob was a release, a letting go of the overwhelming mix of sadness and happiness. The figure got closer and knelt down next to her. She could feel warmth coming from the space between them. He hadn't touched her hands yet, but just being there showed that he understood, cared, and knew how much pain she was in. At that moment, the manuscript keeps a detail that Western accounts leave out: the comforting conversation that came after. He spoke to her softly and gently, choosing each word carefully to comfort her broken heart. He said things that took her out of despair and led her to the dawn of hope. "Don't keep sadness in your heart, Mary. What you mourn is not lost. The life that was taken has been restored. You can only see shadows right now, but soon you will understand everything that has happened." Each phrase, as it is written in the Ethiopian manuscript, has a meaning that goes beyond the story itself. It's not just a story about coming back to life. It's also a story about how people feel, how they lose things, and how amazing it is to recognize someone. Mary felt each word sink into her soul, loosening the knots of sadness and letting light into the dark places where she had felt alone. She could see clearly when she looked up, and for the first time, she really saw him. The shining presence, glowing and glorified, seemed to be alive even after death. Her shaking slowed down a little, and she felt a fragile sense of awe and wonder at the miracle that had happened in front of her. She instinctively reached out to him, her hands shaking a little, as if she were trying to touch the divine through the veil of human understanding. The moment was almost too much for her to handle. The mix of recognition, relief, and joy almost made her lose control. Jesus looked at her with steady, loving eyes that showed he understood her devotion and pain. Mary felt not only relief but also confirmation of her role in the story as it unfolded in that look. People recognized and honored her loyalty, tears, and faith even when she was at her lowest. It wasn't just an encounter with the risen Christ. It was a personal, close confirmation that her heart and efforts were seen, valued, and loved. This was the most detailed part of the manuscript that was still there: how the divine interaction honored the human heart, capturing the fragile balance between sorrow and transcendence. The garden, which had been quiet and full of mist, now felt full of new life. Birds started to move, and their calls broke the peaceful light with soft music. The wind whispered through the olive branches, as if the earth itself was celebrating her recognition. Mary's tears slowed down, and she felt clear for the first time in days. Seeing him, hearing him say her name, and feeling how much he cared for her was like a new beginning of hope. She understood that sadness could be present with happiness, sorrow with recognition, and despair with light. This meeting has a very personal meaning for the modern viewer. Loss, longing, and uncertainty have always been with us. But in Mary's story, which is kept in an Ethiopian manuscript, there is a clear way to deal with those feelings. Recognition, acknowledgement, and tenderness transmute despair into courage. The close details of what Jesus said and how she reacted remind us that grief doesn't have to separate the soul, and that even when we are at our lowest, the divine can meet the human heart. Mary slowly got up from the ground, still shaking but with a new sense of purpose. With each step forward in the garden, the weight of her grief got lighter. She realized that she had experienced something that was beyond her understanding but completely accessible in her human experience. Her heart, which had been heavy with loss, now held the spark of hope, the start of understanding, and the realization that life, even after death, could still be beautiful, connect people, and bring light. The manuscript doesn't just record history. It also captures the emotional truth of how people interact with God. It preserves for all time the moment when sadness turned into recognition and despair turned into hope. The darkness of Sheol was complete. and the silence was so thick that it felt like the weight of eternity was resting on unseen shoulders. There was no wind, no light, just the heavy void of waiting, where generations of people had been waiting in the dark. In that eternal prison, the patriarchs, Adam, Enoch, and Noah, stood or knelt in reverent hope, their eyes searching for a glimmer of hope and their hearts heavy with centuries of waiting. Time didn't mean anything here, but the quiet throb of expectation seemed to ripple through the dark, a subtle vibration that hinted at the impossible about to happen. And then a light appeared, not shy or careful, but bursting out of the fabric of the unseen and breaking up the dark. It rolled across the dark space like a wave of light, never stopping, moving toward every chained soul. The gates of Sheol, made of pure despair and darkness, shook as it got closer. Stone and metal both couldn't handle this light, and slowly but surely, the walls broke and splintered. Light streamed through the cracks, waking up hearts that had long since lost hope and illuminating faces that had been used to darkness. It also made everyone gasp in amazement who had been waiting for thousands of years. Jesus stood at the door, and his body shone in a way that no one could understand. Every move he made showed both authority and compassion. He didn't just walk, he moved with purpose, and just being there made the weight of hopelessness go away. "The light has come for you," he said. The sound went through his bones, heart, and spirit. The words were simple, but they had a big effect. Chains that had kept souls in place for hundreds of years fell away as if they were turning into nothing. Fear and despair shrank back from the power and love in his voice, which was so bright that they couldn't stand it. The patriarchs, who had been quiet, felt the weight of the moment settle over them. Adam, the first man, whose choices had once put humanity in danger, now saw what had been lost come back. Enoch, who had walked with God and been taken before death, saw the promises made in secret prayers come true. Noah, who lived through the flood, knew that the flood of judgment was just a sign of the victory that was to come. Their hearts, which had been heavy with hope for a long time, now soared with awe and recognition. Every soul that had been stuck in despair felt free from the chains of doubt and shadow. The manuscript kept amazing details that Western texts don't have, like the chains that fell with a sound, the ground shaking slightly as darkness itself began to pull back, and the whispering of freed souls in a chorus of wonder and thanks. Jesus' trip through the underworld was not a quiet or abstract event. It was a cosmic explosion, a battle fought not with violence but with the power of God's presence. He could not be contained by darkness, which was old and seemed to last forever. It shook, broke, and fell apart in defeat. Every shadow that had touched the living and the dead ran away from his light, unable to stand the purity and power of his being. Souls rose, confused at first because they weren't used to being free, and shaking as centuries of being locked up fell away. Some people instinctively reached up, their hands reaching for the light that lit up their chains. Their faces showed a mix of confusion, awe, and tentative hope. Every step forward was a statement: life over death, light over darkness, hope over despair. His voice softened, and he was patient but firm as he said, "Do not be afraid of what you have gone through. That which was hidden is now revealed in light." These words, preserved in Ethiopian texts, carry a weight that can't be measured. They are a direct testament to the power of resurrection and God's authority over the most absolute of imprisonments. The energy in the underworld changed from hopelessness to amazement. The darkness, which had been impossible to see through, now broke into pieces that shone like broken mirrors, showing the faces of those who had been waiting for help. The chains fell to the floor with a loud clang and a lot of metal, but the sound felt like a celebration, like the ringing of bells announcing freedom. Souls who had only known being trapped now felt movement, freedom, and the first taste of hope since they had been trapped. At first, their voices were quiet, but then they sang a song of thanks and awe for the one who had come to them in their deepest pain. Ethiopian manuscripts give a lot of detail about this descent, which makes the victory over death feel real and immediate. Jesus didn't just rise. He came down to take back every place where darkness had tried to take over. His presence destroyed the idea that death was final and that shadow could ever have a lasting hold on humanity. Every freed soul saw the unimaginable size of God's victory. Their freedom was proof that death and darkness are only temporary and that hope can be found even in the most hidden and forgotten places. The pictures in the manuscript show the underworld not as a still place, but as one that reacts, chains clattering, shadows recoiling, stones shaking, and even the air shaking from the power of the divine passage. It has a cinematic feel to it. You can picture the light rolling like waves, the shadows breaking like glass, and the echoes of chains sounding like music of freedom. This scene isn't just abstract theology, it's a real, emotional experience that lets readers and viewers feel the stakes and see the triumph over forces that have held people back in fear, despair, and doubt throughout history. At this very special time, the story's importance is clear. It goes beyond time and culture. Every soul, regardless of duration of confinement or disorientation, is assured that light can penetrate their circumstances, that hope can rejuvenate them, and that death is not the ultimate conclusion. The Ethiopian manuscript records these events not as allegory, but as direct evidence of what can happen when God intervenes directly in human life. It is a vision of freedom that is so strong and immediate that the person watching it can feel the weight of darkness being lifted, the joy of freedom, and the overwhelming presence of grace. And as Jesus led the freed souls toward the light, the underworld seemed to change in response. The gates that used to mean being stuck were now broken, scattered, and useless. What had been a place of waiting and silence turned into a hallway of victory and new life. The patriarchs and countless other unnamed people followed him in awe, their chains gone and their spirits lifted with joy. Every word, gesture, and step showed not only freedom but also a cosmic truth. Life, light, and hope are stronger than death, darkness, or despair. The air around the tomb was heavy and tense, and the quiet of Jerusalem seemed to shake with anticipation. The Roman soldiers were on duty there, and their armor made a soft clinking sound with each careful step. Their eyes were scanning the shadows as if they could sense a danger they couldn't understand. They had been guarding for hours without anything happening, and the boredom of being on guard was made worse by the constant worry about what might happen if the prisoners in this city found a way to break the Roman order. They had been trained to see rebellion, put down uprisings, and keep control, but nothing they had seen before could have prepared them for what was happening right in front of them. A bright, pure light suddenly burst out of the tomb. It wasn't just the flicker of a torch or the soft glow of the moon. It was a light so bright that it seemed to cut through every part of the night. The soldiers instinctively raised their shields and blinked against the sudden brightness, their hearts beating in time with each other. The manuscript kept this moment alive by saying that the light was brighter than 1,000 suns, so bright that it made all shadows look useless. At first, the ground shook gently, but then it got stronger and stronger, shaking the dust off the stone buildings around them and making the weapons in their hands rattle. Every soldier felt a deep, unshakable sense that something beyond their understanding was going on, a force from another world that was changing how they saw reality. In the blinding light, Figures began to come down, angels, glowing with a soft but undeniable power. They weren't frightening in the usual way. Instead, they were awe-inspiring, a mix of greatness and calm that made you want to pay attention and respect them. Their wings were bright and otherworldly, and they brushed the edges of the soldier's vision. Every movement was graceful and effortless. The soldier's eyes caught glimpses of their shapes, even though they weren't visible to the average person. The soldier's descent was marked by a deep silence, broken only by the soft hum of divine energy vibrating through the air. And then he showed up, not as the weak and mortal figure they had expected, but as one who went beyond the limits of the world. Jesus came out of the tomb, surrounded by light. He was both terrifyingly bright and calmingly authoritative. His gaze swept over the soldiers, piercing not only their armor but the doubts and fears concealed within their hearts. "Fear not the light," he said in a voice that was both soft and strong. It was a sound that seemed to echo inside every soldier's body. The words reached deep into the soul in ways that logic couldn't touch, going past confusion and doubt. Even though each soldier had been trained to deal with rebellion and violence, they all felt a mix of fear and awe. Some soldiers stumbled back, not sure if they were seeing a vision or reality. Their minds were having a hard time understanding the strange things that were happening in front of them. The manuscript talks about how scared they were at first, with their knees shaking, their breath quickening, and their hands gripping their swords too tightly as if to keep them grounded in the real world. But even though they were scared, each heart slowly woke up. The light, the angels, and the voice of the risen Christ brought to life a truth that had been buried for a long time under duty, protocol, and loyalty to an empire built on power and control. At that moment, the soldiers faced a truth that threats or authority could not change. Life had won over death, and divine power could not be hidden, even by stone walls or the fear of Rome. The ground itself shook, with small vibrations growing into a gentle quake that shook both armor and stone. The soldiers felt the earth give in to the event, which reminded them that even the most solid parts of the world recognized how important it was. Some soldiers talked in low voices, asking themselves what they had seen and trying to find words that weren't enough to describe it. Others stopped talking because they were too overwhelmed to put into words the fear, awe, confusion, and dawning realization of something bigger than themselves or the empire they served. The manuscript has an amazing detail. The soldiers weren't hurt directly, but their hearts and spirits were changed forever. They had been at an event that was beyond human understanding, where they saw not only the resurrection but also a cosmic announcement that light and life could never be contained. The angels coming down, the stone rolling away, the brightness of the light, and the voice of Jesus were more than just a show. They were an experience that reached the deepest parts of the human mind. The soldiers couldn't help but realize that this was more than just a story about one man's rise. It was a cosmic upheaval that changed the very limits of faith and reality. But Rome quickly moved to stop the story from spreading. The manuscript hints that the authorities are afraid of what people might say. They know that if this testimony gets out, it could cause trouble, challenge imperial power, and weaken their carefully planned control over the people. The soldiers were threatened, their memories were forced to be quiet, papers were destroyed, and stories were kept quiet. The empire wanted to control history, but even the might of Rome couldn't change what had happened at that moment. The bright light, brighter than 1,000 suns, the angels coming down, and the ground shaking all stayed in the minds of those who were there, impossible to forget or deny. The soldiers' mental and spiritual health were greatly affected. Fear mixed with revelation, and confusion mixed with a sense of power that was too much for them to understand. Some people who left the tomb were haunted by the bright light, the voices, the shaking of the ground, and the fact that the risen Christ was there. Some people tried to explain it away by saying it was an illusion or by giving it a natural cause. But even their doubts were tinged with awe and spiritual awakening. The manuscript stresses that the human heart cannot completely forget what it has seen, and the memory of light, truth, and divine authority stayed with those who had sworn to keep quiet. The events of that night illustrate a vital principle retained solely in the Ethiopian texts. Rome may endeavor to manipulate narrative, coerce witnesses, and stifle testimony, yet divine truth remains uncontainable. Even though the soldiers were scared and forced to be quiet, they all knew deep down that they were going to rise again and that they had power that could not be taken away. The manuscript keeps their reactions so that modern readers can understand the full meaning of the resurrection beyond the familiar Gospels. The cosmic, the miraculous, and the human response to the unfathomable encounter with light and life beyond death. The night, which had been normal, became extraordinary. It was a turning point that the empire couldn't see, but it will always be remembered in spiritual history. Soldiers who had been tools of human power saw divine reality. They were scared, awed, and unable to put into words the understanding that something much bigger than the empire had been shown to them. That night, the gates of control, the limits of human power, and even the expectations of history were shaken. The Ethiopian manuscript kept the testimony safe for those who were brave enough to face the truth. The room was dark, the heavy wooden doors were locked, and the air was thick with fear and tension. The apostles huddled together, their faces pale and their hands shaking as they held onto their cloaks or the edges of the benches. The quiet outside was almost worse than the sound of danger. Every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of wind through the cracks in the stone walls made them more nervous. They had seen their teacher die on the cross and had watched the life leave his body. The horror of that day still hung over them like a heavy blanket. Their minds went over and over every moment, every accusation, and every time they didn't stand up for themselves. Guilt ate away at them all the time. Why had they run away? Why did fear make them weak when they needed to be brave the most? People started to argue in whispers and sometimes louder than whispers. Peter walked around the room, muttering words of blame at himself and others. He was angry and sad at the same time. John tried to calm him down, but even his presence couldn't get rid of the tension or the feeling of hopelessness that was in everyone's heart. Thomas, who was always doubtful, said things that hurt like knives, not about faith itself, but about their inability to act and how weak they were when the world needed them to be strong. Some people quietly cried and wiped their tears away before anyone could see them. Others left trails of tears down their tired, sad faces. The room felt smaller and smaller as the hours went by. The walls seemed to close in, and the air got thicker with every second. Fear had grown so strong that it felt like it was alive, breathing with their quickened hearts. Suddenly, a light that was unlike any other started to fill the room. At first, it was very faint, almost unnoticeable. It was a glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The apostles stopped moving, and their breaths got stuck in their throats. The manuscripts go into great detail about this moment. The light didn't cut shadows. It dissolved them, replacing fear with a warm, all-encompassing presence. The air seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that shook their bodies and spirits in equal measure, making them feel both uneasy and at ease. He showed up before they could understand what was going on. Jesus was in the middle of the room, and the locked doors didn't stop him from being there. His face glowed like fire, not eating but lighting up, giving off a warmth and power that chased away the darkness around them and inside them. The manuscripts keep track of every small movement, the way his hand moved slightly, the way his gaze calmly swept across each of their faces, and the way his eyes seemed to see into every corner of their fear and doubt. When he spoke, his voice was steady and melodic, and it echoed in their hearts more than their ears. Peace be unto you. Don't let fear control you. Forgive as I have forgiven, and take the mission I give you with courage. The words not only comforted, but also changed things. The room, which had once been full of sadness, seemed to grow. The walls seemed to stretch out, as if the light itself needed more room to breathe. Fear didn't go away right away, but it did start to change. Hands that were shaking let go of their grips on benches, and eyes that were downcast slowly rose to meet his. Peter, whose guilt had been a storm that couldn't be stopped, fell to his knees. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders, and the unbearable self-blame was replaced by a spark of determination. John, who had quietly carried the pain of their failure, felt a spark of courage ignite within him, a call to bear witness beyond the walls that had kept them hidden. Thomas, who had been doubtful for a long time, could no longer doubt what was happening in front of him. The real presence of resurrection filled him with awe and a new sense of purpose. The manuscripts keep details that are often left out of Western accounts, like how the apostles couldn't fully understand at first and how their fear mixed with awe until they finally got it, like the slow rise of the sun. Jesus walked among them, taking slow, deliberate steps that were still gentle. He touched their shoulders and reached for their hands. He spoke directly to each apostle's heart. Every word seemed to have weight, holding them down, tying them together, and reminding them of the mission that was bigger than their fears. You must love as I have loved. Bring life to the world in every word, every act, and every thought, just as I have risen. The change was slowly becoming clear. The shaking hands stopped shaking, the hunched back straightened, and the eyes were no longer looking down but were focused and understanding. At first, there was only a little bit of conversation. Then it grew with questions, clarifications, and finally, a resolution. Planning, thinking, and a new sense of purpose filled the silence. The manuscripts show this small change in a way that feels almost like a movie. The fear that had filled the room disappeared like morning mist before the sun, leaving courage, conviction, and clarity behind. Jesus' words were more than just instructions. They were a way to pass on power. The apostles knew that their fear was normal, but it would no longer define them. Every word spoken had the power of forgiveness and the spark of a mission. They were not judged for their mistakes, doubts, or grief. Instead, they were allowed to rise above themselves. It wasn't an instant change into fearless warriors. It was a moment that everyone can relate to when fear is met with grace and purpose comes from doubt and anxiety. The room, which used to be a tomb of feelings, now felt alive. Shadows moved back to the corners, where they couldn't stand the light. Every corner, every stone, and every breath seemed to echo the promise that fear can turn to fire when you understand it and are present with it. This fire is the fire of resolve, action, and unwavering faith. Peter said to John in a low voice, almost a whisper, "We have to go. We can't stay here. We have work to do." John nodded, knowing that the fear he had been hiding had turned into a calling that was too strong to ignore. Even the most skeptical of them felt it. After a long time of doubt, Thomas stood up completely. His doubt was replaced by an unshakable belief that they had not seen a vision or an illusion, but reality, the risen Christ standing among them, speaking peace, forgiveness, and purpose. The manuscripts focus on the human emotions that were present during the meeting, the tears of relief, the shivers of awe, the quiet laughter that sometimes broke through, and the sound of release as the apostles realized that their worst fear had been overcome and a new mission awaited them. This time in hiding turned them from scared men into witnesses who would spread the story of resurrection, light, and hope to the farthest corners of the known world. Fear, which had once kept people from moving, had turned into fire. Hearts that had been heavy with sadness were now full of purpose. Every word, gesture, and look from Jesus had been a spark, not of panic, but of awakening. The apostles were no longer just followers hiding behind locked doors. They were the ones who would carry the message of resurrection across time, bringing with them the miracle of life over death and the deeply human truth that fear becomes courage when it is met with grace. For 40 days after he rose from the dead, Jesus was with his disciples in ways that went beyond what people could understand. He taught them not only with words, but also with his presence, vision, and revelation. The Ethiopian manuscripts kept details that the Western Gospels didn't, moments that felt both personal and universal, subtle and very strong. The disciples, who had already gone from being afraid to brave, now became students of secrets that had never been shared in public. These were lessons that were too deep and sacred to be written down for anyone who wasn't ready. Every day started off quietly, with the early morning sun shining on the stone floors of private rooms. The disciples would gather around, waiting in a mix of excitement and awe. The first thing Jesus talked about was the kingdom of light. It wasn't a kingdom of walls and crowns. It was a kingdom of energy and being, where love, wisdom, and power all worked together perfectly. He didn't say it was a place to go. He said it was a state of being in line with divine order. The disciples paid close attention, trying to understand how big the revelation was. He said, "This kingdom is where the unseen flows, where angels move like currents in a river, and where your soul can touch the eternal without being tied to this world." The words were soft but powerful, and they echoed in every heart as if the walls themselves were amplifying their meaning. The manuscripts describe his teachings on angels in ways that made them seem much more than just God's messengers. Jesus told them what they were supposed to do, both in duty and in spirit. Some were guardians, some were teachers, and some were warriors, all working together for a common goal that was guided by God's will. He showed how they felt, how happy or sad they were when people did well or poorly. The disciples were told to see angels as more than just protectors. They were also to see them as mirrors of what people could become if they followed God's light. One night, Jesus raised his hand and pointed to the sky. The disciples saw shapes of beings glowing and moving like a dance of stars, each playing its part in the delicate balance of creation. He said that the soul is like a living, conscious spark that can feel both great love and deep misunderstanding. He said, "Your soul is a vessel for light. Take care of it and protect it, but don't let fear or fleeting desire control it. Even when darkness surrounds you, your soul can find the way because it is part of the eternal." The disciples didn't just hear these words as instructions, they felt them as revelations. Some people cried quietly as they felt the weight of their past fears lift and their inner strength and purpose grow. Others wrote furiously, trying to capture even small bits of what they were seeing, even though they knew that no human language could fully express the truth. Every day had visions, which were times when the line between the physical and the spiritual seemed to disappear. Jesus showed them the order of heaven, lights within lights, beings of different shapes and powers, all giving off a sound that people could hear but not fully see. The manuscripts say that this was a living symphony, a changing order that both amazed and comforted the disciples. not meant to be thought about, but felt, a direct, emotional mark on the heart and mind that taught them to feel the divine order and their place in it. The Ethiopian texts also talk about energy and manifestation in ways that seem magical. Jesus taught the disciples that intention, when aligned with God's will, could spread through the unseen fabric of reality. He stressed the responsibility that comes with such knowledge and how thoughts, feelings, and actions can have effects that aren't visible to the naked eye, affecting both their spiritual journey and the world around them. The disciples practiced these lessons in small ways, like closing their eyes, focusing on the light, and feeling their own soul reach out toward the limitless energy that Jesus called the kingdom of light. The stories in the manuscripts also show times when people taught each other in a private setting. Jesus would pull one of his disciples aside and tell them a truth that was right for their heart. He told Peter to be brave but also humble, to John to see love as both a shield and a weapon, and to Thomas to see beyond doubt into certainty without being arrogant. Every conversation felt very personal, but they also had lessons that would be useful to everyone who listened in the future. These lessons were hidden in parables, gestures, and even moments of silence that spoke louder than words. The manuscripts say that these teachings were more important than food and sleep. In those 40 days, time itself felt different, like it was stretched and compressed, as if the disciples were living both in the moment and outside of it. The lessons weren't boring lectures, they were real-life experiences. Jesus would tell them to think about one phrase or action, and then he would suddenly show them a vision in which angels, people, and the physical world were all connected in a way that made hidden connections clear. At the end of each day, the disciples would reflect on what they had seen and felt, often having a hard time finding the right words to describe how deep their experiences had been. During these 40 days, the feeling of closeness to God grew. The disciples learned more than just facts. They learned how to feel, how to flow, and how to take on responsibility. The manuscripts stress how deep these teachings are emotionally. They mix awe, wonder, humility, and joy to make a spiritual mark that could guide them even when Jesus was no longer there. Every detail was carefully copied by hand by people who knew how important it was, so that it could one day be found by those who were ready to receive it. The Ethiopian texts show that Jesus' secret teachings were meant to wake up both the mind and the soul. They were both mystical and practical, emotional and enlightening, deeply human and deeply divine. The disciples weren't just learning facts, they were being changed. They were getting what felt like a spiritual DNA of insight that would change how they understood things, what they were meant to do, and how they would tell the world about the truth of the resurrection. After 40 days, the disciples were no longer the scared people hiding in the locked room. They had become vessels of divine wisdom, with hearts full of clarity and understanding, ready to spread the light. The manuscripts keep the spirit of these days alive as a holy, life-changing time when fear turned into understanding, doubt turned into certainty, and everyday life met the eternal. The resurrection was not just a historical event, it was also a spiritual awakening, a secret knowledge kept by Ethiopia's guardians until those who were ready to receive it. Jesus often talked about a battle that was going on behind the scenes, a war that had started long before people lived on earth. The Ethiopian manuscripts depict his words not as abstract theology, but as vivid, almost cinematic explanations that moved the hearts of his disciples. He painted a picture of light and darkness fighting each other forever, not in a faraway heaven, but in every part of existence. Every act of love, every act of cruelty, and every choice made by people affected the ebb and flow of this cosmic battle. The disciples listened with rapt attention, their hearts racing as if they could feel the universe itself shifting under the weight of his words. He told them that his death was not just a punishment or a tragedy, but a necessary part of the story of the universe. "Do you see," he said softly but with authority, "how darkness wants to keep everything in its grip? Fear, greed, hatred, and despair are the armies of shadow. My pain was a bridge, not a loss. My death was a seed planted in the soil of creation, a seed that could only bloom when life itself returned." His voice had the weight of centuries, the sadness of seeing how weak people are, and the burning hope that came from knowing that God had a plan. The disciples were shocked by how big the truth was. The cross was not just a tool for killing people. It was the point around which all of creation's fate turned. Jesus made this truth more human. He let them see how much pain was in his body, how heavy every lash, every insult, and every betrayal was. But along with that pain was courage, quiet, steady, and unchanging, and an unshakable love for every person, even those who had made fun of him, left him, or tried to kill him. The manuscripts talk about times when his hands would move as if they were reaching beyond the walls to include everyone, every nation, and every generation that hasn't been born yet. His disciples felt his deep empathy as if it flowed directly into them, warming them even as it showed them how much pain he had been through. He said that resurrection meant more than just coming back to life. It also meant changing the universe itself. He said, "When I rose, the powers of darkness lost their power over death. The chains that bound humanity's spirit were shattered. When the light is seen, every evil act reaches a point where it can't go any further. This is why death couldn't hold me, and this is why it doesn't have to hold anyone who chooses the light." The disciples were fascinated, trying to understand the idea without losing sight of their own limitations as humans. They understood intellectually, yes, but also emotionally. The manuscripts show how they reacted: gasps, tears, and hands gripping benches as they tried to hold back the awe that was building inside them. Jesus talked about suffering in a way that made it real for everyone. He told them, "Your struggles are real, your losses hurt deeply, and your fears are heavy. But even these things can be changed. If you carry it with love and understanding, every tear, every wound, and every moment of despair can feed the light. Death isn't the enemy, fear and ignorance are. When you rise in spirit and act with compassion and courage, you become part of the victory I have won." The disciples began to see suffering not just as punishment or fate, but as part of a larger, meaningful struggle that linked human experience with the cosmic dance of light and darkness. The manuscripts contain conversations in which he talks about how every act of love and forgiveness has effects that go beyond what we can see. He said, "You break a chain when you forgive. Being kind is like lighting a candle in a dark world. When you choose courage, you join the fight that I have fought and am still fighting." Each word had many meanings, both mystical and practical, and the disciples had a hard time understanding how human actions could be so deeply connected to the cosmic scale. But the emotional impact made the truth clear. Their lives, choices, and faith were important in a universe much bigger than they could see. He didn't try to hide his own humanity in these lessons. The manuscripts talk about times when he would stop, touch his own side, close his eyes, and let the weight of the cross, the nails, and the loneliness wash over him again. His followers knew that being brave didn't mean not being afraid. It meant keeping going even when you are. They thought that his love was strong enough to cover all of creation, save even the darkest parts, and change the very fabric of reality. The conflict between suffering and purpose taught me not to run away from it, but to face it head-on, not to deny it, but to rise above it. Jesus then talked about hope in a way that spoke to every human desire. He talked about light breaking through darkness, life coming from death, and the soul finding freedom even when it is sad. The manuscripts show that he used pictures that the disciples could understand, like a star coming out of a stormy sky, a river cutting through stone over hundreds of years, or the sun rising over mountains after a long night. Each analogy was meant to make them feel something true, that their pain, fear, doubt, and love were all part of a meaningful, living story. Finally, he linked his teachings about the universe to the problems people face every day. You will see pain, he said, you will see cruelty, and you will feel fear. But remember that these are only temporary waves in the vast ocean of life. Your courage, love, patience, and forgiveness create waves that go beyond what you can see, shaping destiny, touching souls, and taking part in the cosmic victory over darkness. The disciples could feel it in their bones. There was a deep connection between what people do and what the universe wants. They knew that his death and resurrection were not things that happened a long time ago, but things that are still happening and affecting every choice, every act of faith, and every heartbeat of creation. The Ethiopian manuscripts keep every detail: how Jesus' voice rose and fell like the tides, how warm he was, how tears sometimes fell from his eyes when he thought about how people were suffering, and how laughter sometimes broke through when he reminded them of how beautiful redemption is. For 40 days, these lessons were not just ideas. They were lived, learned, and felt by every part of the disciples' bodies. By the end, they could explain not only how resurrection works, but also what it means on an emotional, spiritual, and cosmic level. This knowledge had been hidden for centuries and was only found in these ancient texts. The Ethiopian manuscripts kept truths that had been hidden from the rest of the world for hundreds of years. This wasn't because they weren't important, but because the political and cultural forces in the West made it so that only certain texts were seen as acceptable. The Roman Empire had gained a lot of power over the Mediterranean world, and with that power came the ability to decide what could be considered official Christian doctrine. People often think of the process of forming the canon as purely spiritual or theological, but it was actually very connected to the need for order, stability, and political stability. Leaders were worried that different stories about the resurrection, especially those that were vivid, personal, and sometimes mystical, could cause unrest, confusion, or even challenge the church's authority as it tried to define itself in a large empire. In this environment, many manuscripts that kept different or extra stories about the resurrection were carefully looked over, talked about, and in some cases, quietly put aside. So, the Western canon became more focused on texts that promoted unity and clarity rather than including every detail of the risen Christ's appearances. The manuscripts that were taken out weren't necessarily wrong or false. They were often thought to be too detailed, too mystical, or too hard on the strict rules that were being set up at the time. People's fears of division, their desire for control, and the need to keep the church's authority strong in a politically charged environment all played a role in these decisions. Some scholars in the West question these exclusions, but many of the missing stories just faded away, living on only in whispers, fragments, or copies that were kept in private collections. Ethiopia, on the other hand, had a very different history. It stayed mostly free from Roman and later Byzantine influence in terms of geography and politics. Its emperors, rulers, and most importantly its monastic communities were able to keep texts safe without having to worry about imperial oversight. Monks in Aksum, Lalibela, Debre Damo, and other faraway monasteries took great care of manuscripts. They often copied them by hand, wrapped them in goat skin, and hid them in stone chests or carved spaces in mountains. These communities were cut off from the rest of the world not only by geography but also by spirituality. They saw their job as guardians of sacred knowledge, making sure that nothing important to God was lost to time. The Ethiopian manuscripts kept stories that had private conversations, secret teachings, and subtle thoughts on the resurrection. These were seen as too controversial, too obscure, or too emotionally charged for the canonical texts that were being promoted in the West. For instance, the gentle interactions between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the detailed accounts of his descent into Sheol, and the secret lessons given over 40 days all survived in Ethiopia because the country was not under pressure from the empire or the church to follow Western doctrinal standards. This preservation was not a condemnation of the West. Rather, it stands as a remarkable testament to the resilience of human devotion and the monks' determination to honor the entirety of the texts they received. It is important to know that the process of textual exclusion in the West was not done out of malice or to hide the truth. It was the result of historical events, the merging of cultures, and people's need for order in the face of a rapidly growing religious movement. In this way, the Ethiopian manuscripts became a safe place for details, depth, and subtleties that might have otherwise been lost. The monks who protected these texts knew how important they were. They knew that these words held deep spiritual meaning, cosmic understanding, and personal emotion, and that one day, the world might be ready to hear them. The Ethiopian church made its own canon, which had the Book of Enoch and other writings that aren't in Western Bibles. People valued these texts not because they went against other scriptures, but because they helped people understand more, revealed hidden truths, and gave people guidance in ways that were deeply spiritual and emotionally powerful. Ethiopia preserved a more complete tapestry of resurrection narratives by staying free from Western political and religious pressures. This gave us a better understanding of what the risen Christ did, taught, and said right after he rose from the dead. These manuscripts have survived for hundreds of years of invasions, civil wars, and the passage of time thanks to the hard work, dedication, and sacrifice of generations of monks. They lived in the mountains far away from other people, often in complete solitude, and had to deal with harsh conditions and the boredom of doing the same thing over and over again. They did this not for fame or recognition, but to protect sacred knowledge. They worked carefully, on purpose, and with great care. They copied each word by hand and took care of each scroll. The manuscript's survival is as much a story of human bravery and hard work as it is of divine truth. The difference between the Western canon and the Ethiopian preservation shows how complicated the relationships between history, politics, and religious devotion are. It reminds us that the lack of some stories in the West was not because they were not valuable or real, but because the historical situation made it easier to simplify, centralize, and control. Ethiopia's independence, on the other hand, allowed a more complete account of the resurrection to stay intact. This account includes personal conversations, cosmic insights, and spiritual truths that show the risen Christ in ways that are hard to find anywhere else. In the end, the story is not about judging but about keeping things safe. The Ethiopian manuscripts show that faith can last, that people are committed to the truth, and that it is important to protect wisdom even when it is hard, inconvenient, or not seen. They show that empires come and go, and that human institutions can change or limit stories. However, dedicated communities can keep knowledge safe, so that one day the world may see parts of the truth that were thought to be lost. The manuscripts show that Christ's resurrection was more than just a historical event written down in certain texts. It was a living, ongoing reality that continued to speak through hidden words that were kept safe by people who knew their worth. And while the Western Church made some stories holy, Ethiopia stayed a place of depth, mystery, and wholeness, protecting the very words that give us insight into the cosmic, spiritual, and emotional truths of the risen Christ. In the late 1800s, people all over the world were curious and wanted to learn more. This led to foreign explorers, historians, and theologians coming to the remote highlands of Ethiopia. Not many people could have imagined how deep what was coming would be. They found communities that had been mostly untouched by Western influence for hundreds of years, with jagged cliffs, ancient monasteries on ledges that were hard to reach, and stone churches carved into mountainsides. The smell of incense and old paper filled the air, and the faint sound of chants made a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of history itself. In these holy, quiet places, the secret of Christ's resurrection had been kept safe. Monks who had spent decades in devotion, often alone, were wary of the visitors. They had spent their lives taking care of manuscripts, not getting famous for finding them. But the seriousness of the scholars made them make a decision that had been put off for a long time. A monk carefully unrolled a series of goatskin scrolls in a room that was only dimly lit by flickering candles. The text on the scrolls was written in the ancient Gizi script. The scholars leaned in closer, holding their breath and their hearts racing. These weren't just more copies of a well-known gospel. They were words that described events and conversations that happened right after the resurrection in great detail. These words had been hidden from the rest of the Christian world for almost 2,000 years. One of the older monks, whose hands shook a little from age and devotion, pointed to a scroll and said, "These are the words he spoke after rising." The tone was respectful, almost scared, as if speaking out loud might break centuries of careful preservation. The historians who were used to analyzing the past but not ready for such a shocking discovery could hardly believe what they heard. They ran their fingers over the script, noting how carefully the sacred passages were repeated, the small changes made by previous monks, and the beautiful art that decorated the edges. Every crease, fold, and smudge showed that people had been taking care of it for generations. People who studied the manuscript later called it the Resurrection Book. It had conversations and teachings that weren't in Western texts. The story of Mary Magdalene's meeting, the secret lessons given over 40 days, and Jesus' descent into the underworld were kept in such a clear and deep way that scholars had never thought possible. When translations started to come out, people in academia and theology were shocked and couldn't believe how such a text could have lived alone for so long. But every careful translation showed the same undeniable truth, a story of resurrection and revelation that had been quietly waiting for its chance to speak. The monks said that keeping things safe had always been more important to them than getting attention. People hid scrolls in walls, under loose stones, and in niches carved high above the floors that could only be reached by ladders or ropes. For generations, monks memorized parts, rewrote them by hand, and taught their successors how to copy them exactly, making sure that no word could be lost or changed. People who came to see the monks were often surprised by how strict these methods were, but the monks knew that both devotion and accuracy were needed for these words to live on. The manuscripts were not things to be proud of. They were living truths that were waiting for a world that might one day be ready to accept them. When the scholars started their work, translating line by line, they came across parts that surprised them. The words not only told stories about the past, but they also had deep emotional and spiritual meanings. For example, Jesus gently called Mary, freed souls from the underworld, and explained how light and darkness affect the whole universe. The translators were surprised by how deep these revelations were. They were ready for historical records, not personal lessons that talked about fear, hope, courage, and love in such clear terms. The manuscripts were more than just historical records. They were full of the risen Christ's heartbeat, which connected the past and the present in a way that felt real and urgent. The discovery had a bigger emotional impact because it made people realize how much Western history had lost. For hundreds of years, these moments were missing. They weren't missing because they weren't important. They were missing because of circumstances, geography, and the Ethiopian Church's independence. Scholars thought about how lonely and devoted the monks were, and they realized that keeping these texts safe was nothing short of a miracle. A manuscript that could have been lost in war, buried under rubble, or forgotten about instead survived. A whisper of truth kept safe through hundreds of years of silence. As translations became more common in the early 1900s, the Resurrection Book began to question what people thought about Jesus' life after he rose from the dead. Academics, clergy, and lay people encountered a narrative that highlighted emotional resonance, mystical insight, and profound human connections. The Ethiopian texts depicted Jesus as both cosmic and personal, with his words immediately following his resurrection imbued with comfort, instruction, and hope. These revelations changed the way people thought about biblical scholarship, making them rethink what they had thought was true. The excitement of finding something new was equal to the respect for what had been kept safe for hundreds of years. Scholars frequently describe the experience as both exhilarating and humbling, recognizing that the manuscripts endured due to the dedication of innumerable generations of individuals who entrusted themselves to the meticulous preservation of something far more significant than their own existence. They realized that the truth had been waiting in silence for its time to come, and now it was ready to be heard, thought about, and changed by its message. In addition to having an academic effect, reading and thinking about the Ethiopian manuscripts led to a spiritual awakening in many people. They learned things that weren't just historical. They were very much alive and taught them about bravery, forgiveness, and the cosmic meaning of resurrection. The manuscripts said that Jesus' victory over death was still going on, and that everyone was invited to join in on the light, love, and freedom. Every passage and every conversation spoke to readers in ways that went beyond time, making them feel awe, reflection, and hope as if they were standing in the presence of the risen Christ. The rediscovery of these manuscripts was more than just a historical event. It was a link between old devotion and new curiosity, spiritual hunger and hidden knowledge. The words of Jesus had been waiting patiently in monasteries that were hidden by mountains and lit only by candlelight. And now, hundreds of years later, they were coming out into the world, showing that truth lasts even when it is quiet. It was a story about keeping things safe, being devoted, and the incredible patience of those who knew that some knowledge is too valuable to rush and too holy to show the world until it is ready. The air on the mountain was fresh and smelled like cedar and dirt. The disciples followed Jesus to the highest peak they had ever climbed together. Each step was heavy with weeks of doubt, awe, and fear, but none of them could have known how big the thing was that was waiting for them. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe the scene in amazing detail: the sun shining on jagged stone, the wind whispering through narrow passes, and the tension that everyone who had seen the miraculous events of the last 40 days felt. The disciples were no longer just followers. They had become witnesses to a truth that went beyond time, space, and understanding. When they got to the top, everyone was quiet except for the sound of robes rustling and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. The manuscripts say that Jesus' body began to glow, not with regular light, but with a light that seemed to hold all of life in it. The glow gave off warmth, comfort, and authority all at once, and it touched every heart in the room. Angels, who had never been seen before, appeared in small movements that shimmered and circled around the risen Christ, as if the heavens had opened up in response to his presence. The disciples were overwhelmed, but they felt a strange calm, like when fear turns into awe and confusion turns into the certainty of something eternal. Jesus spoke, and the words that were carefully kept in the Ethiopian tradition held the weight of a world that was both old and always new. He said softly, "Don't be afraid, the light is always with you. Be strong in your faith and let your hearts be guided by courage. Remember that I am with you in every shadow, every trial, and every dawn yet to come." His words were simple, but they had a deep meaning. They weren't orders to follow without question. They were invitations to live fully, to follow the spiritual path that was laid out for each soul, and to bring hope to a world that was still full of doubt and uncertainty. The disciples who had seen the earth shake, the angels come down, and the miraculous release of souls from the underworld, now knew that Christ's mission would never end. These last words were more than the end of a historical event. They were a promise, a plan, and a personal message for everyone who wanted to hear it. Every syllable was full of love, courage, and a call to find the light even when things are dark. The manuscript stressed that the light around Jesus was both physical and spiritual. It was a sign of the eternal light that he had brought to the world, a light that no one could put out. Some of the disciples were crying, while others stood in silence to show their respect. They all felt the emotional weight of the moment. Ethiopian tradition keeps their responses so close that modern readers can almost see their faces. Peter, who was humbled by fear and failure, found strength in the presence of mercy. Thomas, whose doubt turned into understanding, and Mary, whose grief turned into hope and clarity. The manuscripts show that Jesus looked each disciple in the eye and acknowledged their flaws, struggles, and potential. His words weren't just ideas. They were personal, kind, and life-changing. The manuscripts say that as the ascent reached its peak, Jesus slowly rose, his body glowing against the darkening sky. The wind carried whispers of heavenly voices, and the angels moved in ways that people couldn't understand. The mountain itself seemed to respond, echoing the light that spread across valleys and rivers. This was a sign to all of creation that the resurrection was not just a moment in time, but an eternal truth that would echo through the ages. The disciples didn't fully understand it, but they understood enough. The mission that had been given to them was now theirs. They were to bring faith, courage, and light into the world and share not only knowledge but also the deep experience of the risen Christ with anyone who would listen. The manuscripts also keep these last moments quiet, personal lessons. Jesus told them that fear and doubt would always be with people, but that spiritual purpose and light would always be there for those who wanted to find the truth. He said, "Don't let your hearts be troubled. The kingdom is inside you, and the way of courage and love leads to eternal life. Carry this light forward, and the world shall know that hope cannot be chained, nor love extinguished." These words have meaning beyond the immediate situation. They make you think about your own struggles, times of despair, and the choices you make when things are bad. Ethiopian texts talk about a last act, Jesus raising his arms toward the sky, the angels making a protective circle around him, and the light getting brighter and brighter until it seemed to mix with the air and touch every stone, every blade of grass, and every heart in sight. The disciples had a deep realization. Resurrection wasn't just one event. It was a living process that went on with every act of bravery, every show of love, and every step taken in faith. The manuscripts show that this knowledge was meant to be more than just a way to keep history alive. It was a spiritual gift for all generations. The manuscripts change focus to how people react as the scene comes to a close. The disciples come down the mountain with their hearts full of purpose. The light they saw, the sound of angels singing, and Jesus' last words stayed with them. According to Ethiopian tradition, these experiences changed them completely. They were no longer scared, unsure followers. They were now bearers of light and truth, given the task of spreading a message that could inspire courage, faith, and spiritual awakening for hundreds of years. The mountain scene, the glowing light, and the angelic presence all stand for the manuscript's lasting message. That hope is always there even when it's hard to see, that courage can come from despair, and that faith can light up the darkest parts of life. The manuscripts show this last moment not as the end of a story, but as the start of a new one. They invite everyone who reads, hears, or believes to take in the eternal truths that the risen Christ has revealed. The Ethiopian manuscripts ultimately convey a message intended to resonate in the hearts of all who encounter it, that life, light, and love are eternal, and that the words of Jesus, uttered in the solitude of a mountain peak, continue to provide guidance, solace, and purpose in the present day. They show us that having faith in the unseen, being brave in the face of uncertainty, and always looking for spiritual light are not just ideas, but things we can all do. The risen Christ calls every soul to rise, shine, and carry his eternal message into a world that still waits for hope, love, and light to prevail. This is the same truth that the disciples experienced. What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus' resurrection was only half the story? What if the words he spoke after rising from the dead were never meant to be forgotten, yet were hidden from the world for nearly 2,000 years? What if a small, remote country in Africa preserved secrets that the rest of history overlooked? And what if those secrets could change the way you see faith, hope, and the very meaning of life itself? In the mountains of northern Ethiopia, far from bustling cities and the gaze of empires, lies a monastery older than most nations. It sits perched on jagged cliffs, wrapped in mist and mystery, guarding what many have called impossible to protect, a manuscript so ancient that its pages predate countless rulers, wars, and kingdoms. Scholars who have glimpsed it whisper of words so profound that they challenge the familiar stories of the resurrection. Words that reveal conversations and teachings of Jesus after he left the tomb, moments missing from the Western Gospels. The air here is heavy, carrying the scent of old stone, smoldering candles, and the faint aroma of parchment that has endured centuries. Shadows stretch across narrow corridors, and each step echoes with the weight of history. Inside, monks move silently, their white robes brushing the stone floor. They approach the scrolls with caution, as if a single wrong touch could awaken centuries of forgotten knowledge. And there, on a low wooden table, lies the manuscript. Its leather cover is cracked, its edges darkened with the hands of those who protected it through plague, invasion, and time itself. This is not a story of legends or myths. This is a record of events witnessed, heard, and preserved with care. It contains words Jesus spoke in the days after his resurrection, words lost to most of the world for almost 2,000 years. Imagine standing there, staring at the pages, tracing the flow of ancient ink, and realizing that you are witnessing knowledge almost no one else has ever seen. Yet, the urgency of this story is not only in its age. It is in its relevance. Today, countless people feel spiritually lost. They seek guidance, they wrestle with doubt, and they struggle to find certainty in a world full of noise and division. The questions humanity asks now are the same questions early believers asked then. Who is he truly? What does this mean for our lives? What happens after death? These words, preserved in Ethiopia, were meant for those exact questions, waiting silently for generations to arrive at the threshold of understanding. As you walk through this monastery in your mind, the candles flicker against stone walls, casting shadows that dance like echoes of the past. The monk unwraps the manuscript slowly, revealing pages written in Gizi, the sacred language of ancient Ethiopian Christianity. Each line is deliberate, each phrase a carefully chosen piece of a message that transcends time. These are not simple statements of fact. These are intimate conversations, lessons, and reassurances spoken by Jesus himself after conquering death. Words meant to comfort the fearful, strengthen the wavering, and guide the lost. The manuscript begins to unfold the story in ways few have imagined. It describes Jesus appearing not as a distant, unreachable figure, but as someone who speaks directly to hearts, acknowledging fear, doubt, and sorrow. It captures moments of tenderness, of recognition, and of courage that the Western texts barely touch. Here, every detail matters: the trembling of a disciple, the disbelief in Mary's eyes, the quiet awe of those who first saw him again. And as you imagine these scenes, you begin to sense the weight of what has been kept hidden, a fuller, richer story of resurrection that speaks to both the human and the divine. Standing there, as the dust rises from centuries-old parchment, a sense of wonder and anticipation builds. The silence feels alive, almost protective, as if history itself knows the importance of these words. It is a quiet revelation that defies the ordinary. You begin to feel that what you are about to hear is not just a story, but a doorway into understanding, into faith, and into a part of history that was nearly erased. And yet, this discovery is not for scholars alone. It is for you, sitting there right now. You who have come seeking truth, seeking connection, seeking understanding beyond what you have read in familiar texts. Your presence here matters. It validates the journey of those ancient scribes, the monks who risked everything to protect knowledge, and the countless believers who preserved every word with reverence. So, as this journey begins, know this: you are incredibly special to us. Your attention, your curiosity, your willingness to engage means more than any number of views. If you find this story meaningful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who are searching for hidden knowledge. Help us reach 10,000 subscribers so we can continue bringing these ancient truths into the light. We also invite you to comment below with your name, the city you are watching from, and the time you are watching. Every comment connects you to this story in a real way. And if you wish to support this research financially, the Super Thanks feature allows us to continue accessing manuscripts, translating texts, and bringing the forgotten wisdom of history to life. Finally, for anyone who wants to read the original sources themselves, the 88 Books Ethiopian Bible and the Book of Enoch in English are linked in the description. These texts hold the foundation for everything you are about to see and hear. Take a deep breath. Step closer. The story is waiting. The words of a risen Jesus, preserved for centuries, are about to reach you. And nothing you think you know about resurrection will feel quite the same again. The sun rises slowly over Ethiopia's highlands, casting golden light over jagged peaks and deep valleys. The landscape looks like it hasn't changed in a long time. Christianity found one of its first homes here, in a place where the earth rises toward the heavens, long before most of Europe even whispered its first prayers. By the 4th century, Ethiopia had fully embraced the faith, and with it came a duty that few could have imagined: to protect the Word of God when the world outside seemed determined to destroy it. It doesn't start with kings or armies. It starts with monks. They became the guardians of knowledge, quiet, strong, and devoted. Every day, they prayed, studied, and took care of things very carefully to make sure that the sacred manuscripts, the words that had been spoken by apostles and prophets, would survive centuries of chaos. Invaders marched through nearby lands, empires rose and fell, but these simple men kept working in their own little world. Every page copied and every line saved was a deliberate act of defiance against the loss of truth. Ethiopia's monasteries are living proof of this commitment. Aksum, the city with tall obelisks, was both a political capital and a spiritual stronghold. Its stone buildings, which have been carved with intricate designs, have been around for thousands of years. Inside these walls, monks would sit in almost complete darkness, their hands shaking slightly as they traced the old scripts, the ink slowly moving across the fragile parchment. Lalibela, carved from living rock, is breathtaking not only because of its daring architecture but also because of the centuries of devotion that are housed within its walls. As you go down stone steps to underground chapels, you can feel the cool air and hear the chants that have been going on for hundreds of years. Debra can only be reached by climbing steep cliffs with ropes. It is the most peaceful place on earth. It was not by chance that it was so far away. It was a necessary barrier to keep intruders from destroying the texts inside. The monks themselves are very different from each other. Their lives are hard, strict, and lonely, but within that discipline grows a devotion that goes beyond pain or being alone. They get up before dawn, and their hands are rough from carrying heavy books and taking care of flickering lamps. They chant for hours at a time, and their voices mix with the stone to make a sound that seems almost alive. They fast, pray, and go through storms and hunger, all for words that the outside world may never hear. They are dedicated not for fame or recognition, but because they know how fragile truth is. They know that once a manuscript is lost, it can never be found again, along with the voices of the people who first walked with the risen Christ. Ethiopia's role as a safe haven for forgotten truths becomes clear in these monasteries. While empires in Europe and the Middle East fought over religion, deciding which books were holy and which ones could be thrown away, Ethiopia became a place that was not under the control of any empire. The rough mountains and deep valleys kept people safe, both physically and spiritually. Here, the manuscripts could stay whole and untouched by political ambitions or theological arguments that often changed the meaning of sacred texts. This was not an easy choice. It was forced by faith, history, and geography. Picture yourself walking through these monasteries. The smell of incense is strong in the air, and it sticks to stone walls and woven tapestries. Light comes in through small windows and falls on pages that have been around for hundreds of years. The ink is still sharp against the yellowed parchment. You can hear the soft voice of a monk reading aloud in Gizi, Ethiopia's ancient language. It sounds like he is talking to people who lived 2,000 years ago and to people who will come hundreds of years later. Each word is carefully chosen and each tone is carefully chosen because here, words are not just written down. They are kept, protected, and made eternal. It seems like the mountains are also doing this sacred duty. Aksum is a city that is connected to history, myth, and devotion. It rises from the highlands. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela sit quietly under the sky. Their huge shapes were carved out of living stone by people and with the help of God. The steep cliff of Debra is hard to get to, and it stands guard over the entrance to knowledge that few people can see. These places are more than just physical spaces. They are spiritual landscapes where every stone and hallway has been filled with faith and strength for hundreds of years. For the monks, preserving things is not a job, it is their calling. They live in almost complete isolation and sometimes don't see the sun for days, but their faith is still strong. They know that every manuscript they touch has been touched by many other people, and that each scribe made sure that no word, phrase, or idea was lost to time. They put up with pain, bad weather, hunger, and being alone, all for the sake of knowledge and truth that can't be measured in gold or silver, but only in loyalty and care. Ethiopia became the quiet protector of a message that might have been lost to history. This land held on to what was most important, even though other countries fell to the pressures of empire, conquest, and control. It is here that the words of Jesus, spoken right after he rose from the dead, were quietly written down, copied, and kept for future generations. These were not just notes or summaries. They were in-depth stories and conversations meant to guide, teach, and comfort generations who might have otherwise been spiritually lost. When you picture yourself standing in these old halls, you start to see how big the job is. Every monk, every copied word, and every careful stroke of the pen is a thread in a tapestry that has withstood both natural and political storms in human history. Without them, the voices of the risen Christ might have been completely quiet. Instead, the world got a rare treasure because of their hard work, an unbroken chain of knowledge that talks about hope, teaching, and the deep effect of a man who rose from the dead to speak to people again. These mountains, these monasteries, and this land are more than just history. They are a living proof of how strong faith can be and how far people will go to protect what they know is sacred. The words of Jesus came from these remote, sometimes hard-to-reach places, where they were protected from time, lost empires, and the passage of time. In Ethiopia, the last whispers of ancient Christian truth have survived. They are waiting for people who are willing to look for them, hear them, and understand how important they are. The trip started in silence, with only the sound of boots crunching on gravel and the distant call of birds echoing off jagged cliffs. Scholars, explorers, and monks from all over the world had come to see an artifact that no one else had ever seen. The path was dangerous, going through narrow mountain passes where fog clung to every ledge and old monasteries stood like stone sentinels against the sky. For a long time, people had heard rumors about a manuscript so old and holy that it contained the exact words Jesus spoke after he rose from the dead. These words were kept safe while the rest of the world didn't know about them. Torches flickered on the dark walls of a cave that was hidden behind the monastery. Shadows moved across rough stone surfaces, showing places where ancient relics had been left alone for hundreds of years. The smell of dust, incense, and time itself filled the air. Every step sounded louder than it should have, as if the walls knew the secret that was waiting for them. A bundle wrapped in goat skin and tied tightly with fraying leather cords rested on a low stone pedestal in the deepest chamber. The monks moved slowly and carefully, their hands steady but respectful, knowing that even a small mistake could ruin something that had lasted for 2,000 years. The monk whispered, almost in a trance, "These are the words he spoke after rising." The scholars leaned in closer. It sounded like the voice was floating in the air, mixing with the torchlight and the smell of old stone. There was a long pause before anyone spoke. The heaviness of what they were seeing and about to read filled the room like a physical force. Slowly, the bundle was unwrapped, and each layer of leather revealed centuries of careful preservation. There it was, a scroll written in Gizi, the holy language of Ethiopian Christianity, with dark ink on old parchment. The manuscript was more than just old, it was full of history. Every line had been carefully copied by hand and kept safe by monks for generations who knew how important each word was. It stayed alive thanks to hard work and smart thinking. It was wrapped in goat skin to keep it from getting wet and rotting, hidden in stone chests carved into the walls of monasteries, and moved from one safe place to another during times of famine or invasion. Every monk and scribe added to a long line of preservation that lasted for hundreds of years. This made sure that the message inside could survive both the weather and the fading of human memory. As the scholars' eyes got used to the dim light of the torches, they looked both shocked and amazed. Some people leaned forward, their hands hovering over the scroll as if they were afraid it would break. Others stepped back, feeling the weight of history in every letter. They had thought they would get bits and pieces, maybe summaries or notes, but this was much more than anyone had thought. There were whole passages that talked about what happened right after Jesus rose from the dead. They were written clearly and precisely, and they captured conversations that Western Gospels only hint at but never go into detail about. The responses were quick and strong. With a shaking finger, a historian traced the letters and whispered, I never thought we would see this." Another scholar put a hand on his chest, as if he could feel the past there. Shock turned into respect. The room was quiet for hours, except for the soft rustling of parchment and the sound of monks chanting in the hallways above. Every line of the manuscript seemed to bring the room to life, making a link across time that neither the scholar nor the monk could fully explain. The manuscript itself showed an incredible amount of